Onassis Foundation. Dublab.
Welcome to the Quarantine Tapes, a daily podcast from Onassis LA and Dublab. Hosted by Paul Holdengräber, this series chronicles shifting paradigms in the era of social distancing.
Hello.
Hello, could I please speak with Anand?
This is Anand.
Anand, what a pleasure to have you as part of the Quarantine Tapes. Thank you so much for taking the time. I'm really delighted to have you on this show. Tell me, what have you been up to over the last 3 months? Or differently put, how have you been living this quarantine?
In a couple of interesting ways. First, I began and ended the production of a television news and talk show during this period, which was, a spectacularly ill-advised time to do it. It happened in a strange way where we decided to make this show with Vice TV, the channel, right before everything got bad in March.
Yes.
And we had a full developed plan in place for a non-COVID world show, and all these ideas about the kind of people we would have on and the kind of discussions we would have and all the places that I would go and all of that. And maybe we met twice in person. The second time we met in person, COVID was starting to cast a shadow. There was, hand sanitizer being passed around during the meeting, some people not shaking hands, some people still shaking hands. And you felt strange being one of the people who didn't want to shake hands. We had a Monday meeting after that meeting that was in a bar near my house. I tried to cancel it because I felt maybe it was starting to get risky to have meetings. This is so early March. And the two guys I was meeting with kind of made fun of me about my fear. And so we ended up meeting. And then suddenly the consciousness of the country changed and everybody was running away from this thing. And we decided that we were going to still make the show, but in quarantine. So everybody was dispersed, everybody in different locations, no studio. And we made this show through laptops and cameras and sleight of hand, simplified the idea, me interviewing people, me doing monologues, everyone working together through terrible Zoom calls. And we managed to make a show that ran for the 8 weeks that we'd agreed. And now, as often happens in television, the show is no more.
But why? Why? Because I watched some of the episodes, which are terrific. Why did it stop?
Probably because the episodes were terrific. No, I'm just kidding. I mean,
okay. Okay.
As you know, in America, there are considerations of ratings and commerce that drive these kinds of decisions. And the show was not a success, I guess, from the vantage point of people who live inside the cells of spreadsheets.
Well, that does sort of bring us to various subjects we will be discussing. I love one of your formulations, Anand, where you say authors leave breadcrumbs for future writers. And you mentioned this particularly in connection to Thomas Piketty. You say in his book, in Capital, he says, rising inequality relies perhaps primarily on the effectiveness of the apparatus of justification. What do you mean by that?
Well, first on the breadcrumbs thing, I think when you're a writer of any kind, there are certain things that are, within your control and within your expertise or within your ability to think about. And then there's a bunch of other things that are not. And in the course of doing academic research or reporting of the kind that I do, or other types of research for making a book, you come upon certain types of things that you feel are maybe important to your project, but you're not the guy for the job.
Right.
And what you might do is you leave those as breadcrumbs. Academics do it all the time, as you know, and they say, future scholars might consider blah, blah, blah. It's like very cute. And it's also a way of course, absolving yourself of responsibility for doing that particular part of the work. So Piketty leaves this breadcrumb. Well, he's an economist. He's not as, a sociologist or a culture guy, although his new book, which I have not read yet, looks like it's taking a turn in that direction of looking at culture. And so he had made this important argument about the structure of economic growth and economic inequality, and made a compelling mathematical, statistical, econometric case. And he left this little breadcrumb of whether or not the trends I'm describing keep going depend on how well people are going to be able to sell bullshit to justify it. And that's not my work, but that seems important. And I remember I was at the very beginning stages of researching Winners Take All and not sure what I was doing and not sure what the nature of the project was. It takes time to see clearly. And that gave me my marching orders. It was a moment of real clarity, almost a screenplay worthy moment of actual revelation where you say, aha, I got it.
What happened?
I'm writing about
what happened?
I think I realized that what I could do is precisely the thing he thought maybe he couldn't do, which is write about the apparatus of justification of an age of inequality. In other words, an age of inequality is not only sustained by the facts of the distribution of resources in that age, or by the public policies in that age, or by the fact that billionaires are inherently powerful people, because as you know, in Germany or in France and other places, billionaires are also powerful, and a lot of the same situations obtain, and yet you end up with very, very different outcomes in different countries and different moments within history in the same country. And so the importance of story, the stories we tell in a culture, are very, very important to hard power. The kind of hard power distributions we see. And that is a profoundly inspiring thing. I think we often think about something like structural inequality or empire and militarism, these types of things, as being these very hard, fierce, immovable things. But they are completely upheld and inflated by stories that most people think are true, or enough people think are true. And what a writer can do with very little power and force, but a very, very sharp pin, is prick those stories. And if there's nothing to them, deflate them.
We believe these stories are true. This leads me to asking you in some way, what is the role, as it were, of self-deception in perpetuating our economic system?
I think there is the people I wrote about in Winners Take All, who are the winners of this age of capital, are a mix of self-deception and other deception. And I will stereotype it a little bit.
Between self-deception and other deception, tell us.
So think about the people who run Goldman Sachs versus Mark Zuckerberg. Okay, and this is a stereotype a little bit. This is a New York versus Silicon Valley thing, but I think there's some truth to it. I would locate Mark Zuckerberg in the self-deception category and Wall Street in the other deception category. So to start with Wall Street, they do a lot of the same stuff. Philanthropy, charity, the apparatus of justification stuff. Social impact bonds. We're celebrating Juneteenth. We're doing a post in solidarity with Black Lives Matter. We're giving some money away. GS Gives is a program from Goldman Sachs. They do all that same stuff, right? Same stuff that Zuckerberg does. But I don't think any serious person looking at Goldman Sachs or Wall Street from the outside, or anybody in that world, thinks that they're doing it truly to change the world, to make it a better place, to emancipate mankind, right? I think they are in the business of making money. They are pretty honest about it. I find that refreshing. And they understand that some amount of do-gooding and social commitment, or apparent social commitment, is the lubricant in the engine of their continued operation. And I actually have respect for that in a certain way. There's a certain authenticity to it. You go to Silicon Valley and you meet people like Zuckerberg, or many people in the Valley. It is not that. Mark Zuckerberg is not saying he wants to change the world as a cover for making more ad revenue. Mark Zuckerberg would be a much easier person to deal with if ad revenue was his highest motivation. Mark Zuckerberg actually wants to change the world. That's where self-deception comes in. Mark Zuckerberg thinks he is a messiah, a revolutionary, a person who has been, people who are close to him have told me that he feels very lucky. He feels like he got to be in a time and place where he had special access to tools that could change the way every person on the planet lives, and only he can do it. And he wants to be the guy who does that. He wants to liberate girls in Afghanistan. He wants to teach people in India to read. He wants to transform democracy. He wants to do all these things. And in many ways, it makes him more dangerous than the people on Wall Street who at least have the benefit of being insincere in their efforts to change the world.
Can one really speak seriously, do you think, about the failures of the American elites without addressing the failures of American foreign policy?
Well, I mean, I think they're connected, because the question that in an election year that we're in, ordinary people are asking themselves, rightly, and the question behind your question is, who does the society primarily work for?
Right.
Who does it serve?
Right.
When it must make decisions, which it is making, a handful of very, very big decisions every week, and then thousands of micro decisions in every corner of the public life. To whose benefit are those decisions redounding? And the very clear answer is, for most people, is not me or anybody I know, by all apparent evidence. And people are correct in that intuition. It is working for corporations. It is working for wealthy people. It is working for people who have found ways to glom onto the system. And so there's an economic concentration consequence of that. Climate is very much a consequence of that. The reason we don't have universal health care is a consequence of that. The reason the pandemic, became the employment crisis it did is a consequence of that. The reason people, couldn't take a day of paid sick leave to check out if they were sick at the beginning of the epidemic, thus worsening it, is a consequence of that. But also, as you say, empire is a consequence of that. It's not the only reason.
I didn't use the word empire, but you're right.
I mean, who do you think wants us to spend all this money on, on war and preparedness for wars that we may not fight? It's the big defense companies. And so it is all the same thing refracted through different prisms. It is a society that has, over time, made a choice to work for people with money instead of people who are people. And at every, I think a lot of what I try to do in my writing is kind of public teaching about these issues that we all talk about so much that we don't seem to have a very flexible mind on them. Most people don't. Most people think they know what they think about inequality, or think they know what they think about capitalism. So I almost try to avoid using a lot of those words and to say it like this. At every major decision point in American life today, if there is a tension between what is good for money and what is good for people, what is good for money tends to win. And whether you're liberal or conservative, old or young, that shouldn't strike you as correct.
Well, it strikes me so strongly because really what can be done within a system where the two choices for president are, on the one hand, Donald Trump, and on the other hand, Joe Biden, who told a group of billionaires last year that if he's elected, nothing would fundamentally change.
Yeah, and I want to say two things about that, because I feel two opposite things strongly on this.
Only two? Only two? Come on,
may
Anand.
Make me inconsistent.
Come on, Anand. You can do better than that. You disappoint here.
It's quarantine.
Yeah.
It's quarantine.
Yeah. But
first of all, I think, speaking very frankly, Joe Biden is a disappointing nominee for a party that thinks of itself as a party focused on regular people, on working people, on small d democracy, on racial progress. This is someone who, if we are being honest, and if we're not worried about November, which a worry that I will come around to in 30 seconds, I think we have to be honest. I don't think this guy is an avowed racist, in the way that this country is full of actual avowed racists. But I think Joe Biden is someone who, is part of a mid-century modern, genteel, liberal racist tradition in this country that is obvious when he speaks sometimes still today. And certainly is obvious in the kinds of policy choices over the course of his life on mass incarceration and other things. And I don't think there's been enough atonement there. I think the attitude to women, again, he's not the worst misogynist in America. He's not Harvey Weinstein. He's a guy from another time who I think has not done the work that actually a lot of other guys have done in America to become a different kind of guy when it comes to being around women. I've had problems with it, and I've critiqued it, and I still have problems with it. And my hope is that the left will continue to hold his feet to the fire every day of every month of this election year. And then if he's president, continue to hold his feet to the fire and make him better. I do think that is possible. The second half of what I want to say about this is, and this is going to disappoint everybody who liked the first half of what I'm going to say, and vice versa. I think if you are a morally serious person, there is no alternative but to vote against Donald Trump and for Joe Biden in this election, despite all my misgivings about Joe Biden. I don't think you can be someone against fascism, against white supremacy, against misogyny, and simply not make the right vote here. I just don't think this is a meaningful choice for any thoughtful person. I am aware how uncomfortably those two things sit next to each other. I said in the primary, I thought some of Joe Biden's comments on race in one of the debates disqualified him. I said that. And I will tell you right now that I've said that. And I think there is no reasonable moral choice other than to vote for him in this election.
You've spent a lot of time, Anand, with what one could call extremely powerful people. Is there a difference between how they speak publicly and how they speak in private?
I think yes and no. I mean, I will say relative to what I think people imagine out there, I would say the divergence is much less than people think. So I'll give you the caricature in some ways that I've had in my mind before I did this work. In an age of inequality and hyperpolarization, we're all sort of conspiracy theorists light. I mean, I think a lot of people imagine that these shadowy forces, and people are not entirely wrong. I mean, there sort of are these shadowy forces. It's not quite how people imagine it. But there's this sense that Wall Street guys are sitting there talking about, how do we screw people and how do we do this and how do we make sure the African American community never gets ahead? And I think what I realized when I went into this work and did this reporting is a lot of these people, there is that in certain areas, and there are real villains in this world. But a lot of these people in the business world, these winners taking all, are honestly just profoundly self-deluded people who actually think they're making the world a better place, and who think the way to do that is hyper-capitalism, who think the way to do that is paying people as little as possible so they can grow their business, so they can give back to those people through philanthropic activity. I have been in some of these smoky rooms. It is full of people who think they are making the world a better place. And it is that conviction that actually is so difficult. Our society has gotten quite sophisticated at handling straightforward menaces, people who just want to dump toxic waste into rivers. Like, we've figured that out to a pretty substantial extent. People who carry themselves and who genuinely believe that they are making the world a better place are some of the most dangerous people we have. We don't really know what to do with them. Presidents, even more thoughtful than this one, dine with them, seek their advice, get their thoughts. They're treated like thought leaders. People read their books instead of actual books. And it becomes this thing where we all delude ourselves into the idea that the people most responsible for the present inequitable state of our society may be the saviors from the conditions they are still working to cause.
A side question, but one that interests me greatly. I was so amazed by how important he seems to be to you, and it will be wonderful for the listeners to hear something about Albert Hirschman and why Albert Hirschman matters to you.
This notion of exit, voice, and loyalty. The title of his book. This, I would say, I mentioned it in the book, but then after the book came out and I met thousands and thousands of people over a couple of years, so many of them, the question they were left with after reading the book was, what are my choices practically?
Right.
I work for Mark Zuckerberg giving his money away. I work in a hospital dealing with partnership with very bad corporations. I am a 23-year-old working in a nonprofit. It's the only job I can get, and it's funded by some bad guy, but was doing really good work. Should I stay or should I go? So many of the questions were that old song, tell me, I gotta know, should I stay or should I go? And I think that what the Hirschman thing helped me think through as I've talked to people and wrote the book was, in many of these cases, there is a case for leaving. There's a case for saying there's no ethical way to work for Mark Zuckerberg. And Mark Zuckerberg may be someone who's crossed that point where there is actually no ethical path to working for Mark Zuckerberg. I would probably suggest that. But for a lot of people, it comes down to a voice. It may be okay to stay on the condition that you actually use your voice as the price of staying and try to change how those things are from the inside, right? That's the fundamental question so many people ask me. Stay on the inside and make change, or go on the outside. As someone who has been in and out of these systems, it's easy to romanticize leaving the power structure, right? I'm someone who's written for the New York Times and had a column for the New York Times and then the next week did not. And I'm not here to tell you that, tweeting your thoughts is the same thing as having a New York Times column. It's not. It's a lot better to have a New York Times column. So the price of leaving these systems and gaining your freedom and your honesty is also the price of maybe having less capacity to affect change because your platform is kind of negligible. But I always tell people in terms of exit and voice and loyalty, if you're going to do exit, do exit. If you're going to do voice, you're going to stay and speak out. Don't stay and then not use your voice. That's the worst of all outcomes, and that's what happens to most people in these corrupt systems.
Who is using their voice effectively now, do you think?
I think a lot of, obviously right now we're speaking on Juneteenth, which is quickly emerging as a holiday that is going to have national recognition and state recognition all across this country, as it should be. I think a very powerful example of this right now is Black people in all walks of American life, in corporations, in schools, like kids in schools, in academia, in journalism, breaking the rules in many cases to say we have been living in conditions that do not work for us and that do not work for the society and that are not just and that are not commensurate with the moral, claims that the institution makes out in the world. It's not just going to protest. A lot of what folks are saying in these conversations, whether it's the New York Times episode recently or others, is breaking the rules of the institution, breaking a code of not speaking out, breaking a kind of family silence to call out these institutions. And I think it's incredibly brave, incredibly powerful, and it's causing change every single day.
You quote a line, as you know, I'm a quotomaniac by profession. You quote a line that I so much like, as I do most of everything he's written, because it's kind of time bombs that wake you up after you've read them and sometimes usually smile, in this case not so much. But it's so good, of Oscar Wilde, where he says, just as the worst slave owners were those who were kind to their slaves and so prevented the horror of the system being realized by those who suffered from it and understood by those who contemplated it, so, in the present state of things in England, the people who do most harm are the people who try to do the most good. How does that apply to the present moment?
No, it's such an important quote because, and I think it's very counterintuitive for people, right? The argument that I get back from people when they hear a lot of what I'm saying is a kind of but at least argument. Right. Yes, the system is bad. Yes, this person's company may be bad. Yes, there may be too much inequality. Yes, the billionaires may have too much of a corner on the market, but at least Mark Zuckerberg is helping those immigrants. But at least Jeff Bezos is donating $100 million over here. But at least Wall Street is doing social impact bonds for reducing prison recidivism or whatever. And the point I try to make is the but at least activities are what are used to uphold and maintain and lubricate the system that continues to grind people down. And that actually, Mark Zuckerberg is more dangerous to us than a Koch brother in many ways. I am sure that Mark Zuckerberg does not think of himself as the third, more socially awkward Koch brother. But in so many ways, he is, and he is more dangerous because we see the Koch brothers for who they are. They are obvious right-wing, libertarian, anti-government activists, and they're very authentic people. Their business interests align with their philosophy, which aligns with their political action. That's an integrated person. Mark Zuckerberg is someone who has egalitarian ideals, a philosophy that is aligned with the Democratic Party, open to immigrants, open to the rights of all people, and then in practice fights tooth and nail to defend oligarchy, give safe harbor to white supremacy and fascism in the White House, and that is not integrated. And so often the question is what allows Zuckerberg to be Zuckerberg, and it is the aura of do-gooding. It is all the stuff Oscar Wilde was deriding that has actually given him protection.
Right.
And I would say the following thought experiment, which is if you imagined, take the Sackler family, members of the Sackler family involved in fomenting the opioid crisis in the United States, which killed hundreds of thousands of people, genocide, Civil War level numbers of people from a for-profit drug that was hooking people that shouldn't have been taking it in many cases. Now, if that Sackler family, which we all know has been donating to arts museums up the wazoo, you can't go to a city where there's not a Sackler wing, a Sackler gallery, a Sackler museum. And you ask yourself, it's quite interesting. They were killing people all over the place, particularly in the heartland. But all their philanthropy was sprinkled in places where you and I may go, Paul. Places where journalists and writers and thinkers, where they tend to congregate. Why? Because what they needed was for people like you and me to not know the Sackler name in connection with opioids. They needed you and me to only have that name slotted in our minds in connection with the arts.
Right.
And
right.
it worked. And so the question is, if they hadn't done the arts money, I would actually argue the world would have been better off. If they had just bought more food for themselves, I think the world would actually have been better off than it was in the wake of their philanthropy, because their philanthropy provided the cover for continued killing of people.
Very recently, since you were talking about Twitter, you tweeted the following. You said, "The right, despite its anti-intellectualism, has been better at understanding the power of language. Among the many things Black Lives Matter is teaching the left is how to speak clearly, simply, and emotively to transform debates." What are some of the other phrases you'd like to see enter the discourse? And precisely, I think the question of language is so important.
I think there's a very interesting asymmetry in American politics where, as I said in the tweet, that you would kind of casually think of the right as being anti-intellectual, anti-language, anti-education, not into book learning and things like that, things of that nature. But the right has, as Jane Mayer documents in her book Dark Money, has carefully cultivated its thinkers, made sure none of its important thinkers want for anything. Any thinker on the left will tell you that is not the case for the left. Has been incredibly attentive through people like Frank Luntz to the power of language to reframe debates. The estate tax became the death tax, and thus a tax that only affects a very small number of people became something that all Americans who fear death, might have some fear about. The third trimester abortions became partial birth abortion. I mean, you can loathe the game, but you got to admire the hustle there. Partial birth abortion is brilliant phraseology that might make people who are for something against it. And they've done it, with job creators as a term for multi-gazillionaires. So hats off to the right for understanding what you and I take very seriously in our work, which is, playing with the words so that you create a different effect in people's minds, And I look at the left. I look at Bernie Sanders, Elizabeth Warren, Joe Biden. What are the equivalent formulations or efforts on their part? I think Barack Obama had certain gifts in this way. But where is the effort? To me, it all sounds like the same familiar stuff. I look at something like Medicare for All. First of all, I'm not sure that's the best way to put it. That's the name of a government program. That's not that inspiring. That's not reframing a debate. I mean, for all is a bit of good formulation, right? But what's the equivalent of death tax or the wall or partial birth abortion for Medicare for all, right? Is it the health right? Is it? I don't know what it is. But thinking about what is the language where suddenly anybody who was not for that thing is backpedaling and on the defensive. I think the left doesn't know how to do this. And it's funny because probably most of the poets are on the left and most of the literary writers are probably on the left. But somehow this ability to communicate in a way that reframes things, makes people see them anew, is very difficult. And I've had these conversations with people who work in democratic politics saying, you know what, why are you talking about healthcare as a social justice thing, right? Everybody who's into social justice already is with you on healthcare, but it's not enough people, right? You need more people. How are you going to get those more people? Here's an idea. There's a bunch of people in America who like rah-rah patriotism. Now, you may disagree with their politics, but they kind of like that stuff. You know what they like? They like stories like the Normandy story, right? They like that. They got off the boats. Those guys, they ran. They weren't afraid of anything. If their comrades fell, they ran back and grabbed them. So some new bride in Indiana wouldn't have had to worry what had happened. And why don't you tell that story and say, we are Americans. We don't leave each other down on the battlefield. We didn't in Normandy. We didn't here. We didn't there. And we're not going to do it on the battlefield of cancer or of tuberculosis. Well, right? And you just reframe something. So some guy who doesn't really like government, doesn't really like big, healthcare takeovers, but he's a patriot and he kind of likes Normandy, he might give you a second look. That's how politics actually works. And I see this as a skill that is almost completely absent from the American left today.
Anand, what a pleasure it has been speaking with you. I wish we could go on, and perhaps we will when we can see each other in person. But I really want to thank you so much for taking the time today. It's been wonderful to talk to you, and stay safe. And I look forward.
Likewise, same to you. And I hope you stay safe and enjoy the particular charms and misfortunes of quarantine, such as they are.
Exactly. You too. All the best to you.
And to you.
Bye-bye.
Bye.
To support this show and Dublab's progressive programming, go to dublab.com/support.